I'd like to share a poem with you at this moment that's entitled, I Could Be a Whale Shark, by Amy Neju Kumatatil, written in Bolinao in the Philippines. I'm worried about tentacles, how you can still get stung even if the jelly arm disconnects from the bell. My husband swims without me farther out to sea than I would like, buoyed by salt and rind of kelp. I'm worried if I step too far into the China Sea, my baby will slow the beautiful kicks he has just begun since we landed. The quickening, they call it. But all I am is slow, a moon jelly floating like a bag in the sea, or a whale shark. Yes, I could be a whale shark, newly spotted with molds from the pregnancy, my wide mouth always open to eat, and eat with a look that says, surprise. Did I eat that much? When I sleep, I am a flute fish, just lying there swaying back and forth among the kelpy mess of sheets. You can see the wet of my dark eyes awake, awake. My husband is a pale blur near the horizon, full of adobo and not waiting 30 minutes before swimming. He is free and waves at me as he backstrokes past. This is how he prepares for fatherhood. Such tenderness still lingers in the air. The Roman poet Virgil gave his pet fly the most lavish funeral, complete with meat feast and barrels of oaky wine. You can never know where or why you hear a soft humming on this earth. So not too long after I turned 50 years old, I decided, I don't remember why, and I couldn't tell you even if I tried, I decided to go to yoga. I tried yoga once when I was in college. Actually, we were required, I think, to take something like 3 weeks of yoga, and I absolutely hated it. It was the most uncomfortable thing I had ever attempted in my life, and I swore never to do it again. But a lot can happen in 30 years, and I was ready. So I went to yoga classes, and I could tell you about how embarrassing it was to be the oldest person in the class by at least 25 years. I could tell you how embarrassing it was not to have the right outfit, because really you have to have the right outfit, okay? Especially when you go to yoga. And I can tell you how embarrassing it was not to be able to do the fluidity, the stuff that people do when they go to yoga. And they always seem to be flaunting it at the rest of us. But that's my judgmental nature coming out. So over the months, I started discovering, looking for other yoga studios, and I found a place in a very unassuming strip mall where they raised the temperature quite high during classes, and that was really good for someone like me, who once again was at least 25 years older than anybody else in the class. The teacher was not one of your standard willowy, yoga instructors with wavy hair flowing back and a very melodious voice. He was a South Philly guy with a serious attitude and a serious Philadelphia accent, and the worst jokes I have ever heard in my life. Chubby, too. Not willowy, chubby. He turned out to be the best yoga teacher I have ever known. He was gifted in ways I couldn't even imagine. And he was the guy who actually was the first yoga instructor to bring yoga to a football team. He worked actually with the Philadelphia Eagles. So I remember one day, still without the right outfit and still, standing all the way in the back for obvious reasons. I remember one day trying to do a pose, the balance pose that involved standing on one leg and lifting my other leg as high as I could. I'm going like this, but believe me, it didn't go that high. It was more like this. And he came over to me to do what we call an assist. And he gently just took my foot in his hand, and without much effort, he lifted it up about another 1.5 feet. And he held it for a moment, and then he leaned over and he whispered in my ear, "You are so much stronger than you think." And I have to tell you, that sentence struck me like a ton of bricks. You are so much stronger than you think. He could have used any words, but that encouragement was actually something I'd never heard, and something that I don't know how often we say to one another, but in that moment, it was incredible. I had come to yoga. I was at a time in my life where a lot of things had been happening that I had no control over, situations where I was responsible to care for a family and for children that had difficulties that I had no idea how to address. I imagine several of you understand what that's like. And I thought I was supposed to do much better than I was doing, and I carried a sense of powerlessness and fragility that I couldn't have articulated to you in that moment, but in hindsight, I can. When he told me that I was so much stronger than I thought, I can look back now and say that was my first lesson in anti-fragility. It was my first lesson in saying, I can stay in that space, which many of us do, because we as human beings, we have a bias toward the negative. I could stay in that place and think about all the failures or the lack of this, that, or the other. Or I could celebrate the strength and the lessons and the things that had allowed me to survive. Not only allowed me, but that had propelled me into survival and even thriving. Celebrate that strength and look for ways not only to see it in myself, but to see it in others. When I learned not too long ago about this concept of anti-fragility, I remembered that moment and that lesson. What I did not seek until I heard those words from my teacher was my firm and now lifelong determination not to let those demons win. And they are demons. You know, they're not the normal kind with pointy little beards and pitchforks, but they are demons that haunt many of us. For different reasons, we all come to this place to sit together on Sunday morning with different histories and different factors we've lived with. But all of us at one time or another have been aware of the dangers that can cause us harm. Nassim Nicholas Taleb is an eclectic and brilliant scholar and writer, not such a good presenter, which he will acknowledge, but a really interesting person to read. And he's written a number of books, including Anti-Fragility and Black Swan and other really interesting tomes. And the first thing he asks when he's presenting about anti-fragility is he'll say, what is the opposite of fragility? And people will say things like resilience or strength or determination or, many other things. And he'll say, no, none of those words describe the opposite of fragility. The only thing we can call it is anti-fragility. When we don't face head-on the challenges and the distresses and the sorrows that come across us in our lives, when we don't face them and learn how to navigate them, we become or can become increasingly fragile. until the moment when our fragility is such, our defensiveness is such, that we actually lose our capacity to become more anti-fragile. Taleb in his lifetime is a lifelong statistician. He has been an expert on assessing risk. He was one of those guys who stand on the floor of the stock market exchange yelling out bids. I always wondered how they could make themselves be heard, and the bell rings and, the scene changes. He said the most successful traders were the ones who were quiet, not the ones who were noisy. Anyway, during the housing crisis of 2008, he was warned by the powers that be at these, powerful networks of bankers and traders and so on, that he might be in danger, and so he should get a bodyguard. He immediately said no. There were a lot of people really angry at everyone involved in the financial industry at that time. He said, no, I don't need a bodyguard. And then as he tiptoed around New York, he got more and more worried about who might be, sneaking out ready to jump out at him. So he decided to seek out the most fearsome and famous bodyguard in New York City. A 60-year-old man by the name of Lenny Cake. His real name wasn't Cake, but that was his favorite snack. Lenny Cake, I don't know if he still is, but he was, well over 250 pounds of solid muscle, and also with an attitude, but not a Philadelphia attitude, a different kind of attitude. And so when Nassim went to see him, at first intending to hire him, he decided, wait a minute, I'm just going to watch him train. And instead of hiring him to handle my fragility, I'm going to learn how to look like him so nobody messes with me. Well, Lenny Cake's thing was to lift weights, to do something called maximum lift strategy, where every day you increase the weight a lot, and you only do it 3 or 4 times because that's all your body can take. But you're constantly challenging, distressing your body so your body will get stronger. That's the key to anti-fragility. So Nassim started doing that, and he said after a couple months he felt pretty bad, He started wearing dark clothes and a dark turtleneck, and he said people stopped messing with me. Right?
Oh yeah.
So to me, it's a hilarious story, especially the name of Lenny Cake, but whatever. But it's an example he shares to say our bodies need, right? We need some kind of challenge. Otherwise, you know what happens. You turn 50 and you can't lift your leg above 1.5 feet above the ground. It's not just our bodies. It's our brains. It's our species. It's the sense that without facing challenge, we don't grow. And when we don't grow, we begin to wither. And when we begin to wither, we turn to experts who have a lot of knowledge, but maybe have never actually dealt with what we're asking them about. Taleb says he has an allergy against academics and bankers, so he can't usually spend a whole lot of time in their presence because he has a physical reaction. But he says if you want to learn from a financial expert, don't do what the expert says, watch what the expert does. Because when they're playing with their money, they behave differently than when they play with yours. My apologies to any of you who are financial experts. This is not me saying it, it's somebody else. One of the most potentially tragic outcomes of what he describes and what I'm describing is the impact this attitude, this perspective has had in the last several generations of raising our children. Now, I don't know how it was with you when you were growing up, but with me it was, don't come home until it's dark or you're bleeding. Now, my parents would never get any awards for their parenting, don't get me wrong, but it was a different perspective. There was an expectation that we would learn how to manage and how to deal with the very real risks that happen in life. Taleb, and more specifically a social psychologist by the name of Jonathan Haidt, some of you may be familiar with his work, but he's written along with, I think it's George Lukeman is his one of his partners. He wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind and another book called The Anxious Generation. And what they describe is what Taleb is describing, but they call it safetyism, a desire that we were taught as parents in these later generations, that being a good parent meant making sure that our children never encountered distress or challenges or danger or risk, which I totally understand. There's nothing worse than taking your 7-year-old daughter to the emergency room because she decided to do a cartwheel into a metal cabinet. My child was accident prone, but she was eventually fine. But in safetyism, remember when smartphones came out in 2012, 2013? Jonathan Haidt and his partner describe how for many parents who, for 2 generations at least, we all had been told in this country that going outside was dangerous, that you didn't know who your child might encounter, that there might be dangerous predators in your neighborhoods. There's studies that show that communities stopped feeling like safe places for many people in this country. And many parents thought, well, being on the internet has got to be a lot safer than going outside. Well, now that we've met the devil incarnate, Mr. Zuckerberg, and his companions, we know that's not true. But what has ensued are the impacts of safetyism. So why am I telling you this, and what does this have to do with religious community? There's a very specific application that has to do with this religious community as we face a transition in the community over the next 6 months to a year. I want to tell you that from my perspective, you and I together over the last 2+ years, almost 3 years, have been actively cultivating anti-fragility, actively learning from the stresses and the heartaches of the history, of the past in this community, and applying those lessons in very concrete ways. None of us can prevent what happened in the past from possibly happening again, or some other, disaster that could happen. But now, you know what I'm about to tell you, that you are so much stronger than you think. And you are so much stronger than you might have been a few years ago when difficult things were happening here. And this is not an indictment at all, or a judgment. It's a word of congratulations and encouragement. to help you see how far you have come as a community and how strong you have become. And that ability to see things how they are, to take those steps, to apply those learnings to the future is not something anybody can take away from you. Nobody can wave a wand and make you forget. Just like nobody can wave a wand and make me forget the help that I've gotten along the way. Not only that, but as Elizabeth was saying earlier about the social justice work and the outward reaching work of this congregation in our communities, the anti-fragility that you have practiced and will continue to practice will enable this community to continue to grow in those efforts as well. Amen. Ashe, and blessed be.